I'm Joyce Martin, and on behalf of the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, I want to welcome you to the Labriola Center and also to say how happy I am to have Dr. Andrew Graybill, Associate Professor of History, Director of the William P. Clements Center for Southwest Studies from Southern Methodist University, here to speak with us today. Dr. Graybill was born and raised in Texas and coming to us from Dallas today. He was formerly taught in the history department at the University of Nebraska. And in addition to his award-winning book, he is also the author of Policing the Great Plains, Rangers, Mounties, and the North American Frontier, and Bridging National Borders in North America, Transnational and Comparative Histories. So check out those books as well as the award-winning book. Before we begin the program, I'd like to thank a few people without whom this event could not have been possible today. First, I would like to thank Dr. Donald Fixico, who first proposed the idea of the Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award, and thank you to the judging committee. I also want to thank the students who work in the Labriola Center, who helped to set up the room today. And I'd like to thank ASU Library's Business Operations Manager, Lily Johnson, for all of her hard work in pulling this event together, and also University Librarian Sherry Schmidt for her continuous support of all of our events here in the Labriola Center. So we do have refreshments that are available in the classroom following our talk here this afternoon, so please help yourself. And at this time, I'd like to present Dr. Andrew Graybill with the Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award for his book, The Red and the White, A Family Saga of the American Southwest. Graybill. All right, so now I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Graybill and Dr. Fixico for a discussion on Dr. Graybill's book.
Well, welcome this afternoon to this ceremony. I think we're in the 6th year of it, and we're with Dr. Andrew Graybill for this award-winning book. So, Andy, welcome to ASU.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming out today, and to Joyce, the library, for making this possible. It's really, it's very nice to be here. Thanks, John.
Well, this beautiful day is just for you, so this is your day. We want to start out with this program with a bit of a commercial. So the commercial is about the Clements Center at SMU, so could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the William P. Clements Center for Southwest Studies was established at SMU in 1996, really through the efforts of two folks. Governor William P. Clements, who served 2 terms as the state's chief executive, but separated by sort of a lost campaign in between. So from 79 to 83, and then from 87 to 91. And he was an SMU undergraduate from the 1930s, had a real interest in Texas history in addition to oil and gas, which is where he made the money that he then used to endow the Clements Center. But if he supplied the funds, it was David Weber, who I imagine a number of you probably know of or perhaps knew personally, who had the idea of trying to establish a first-rate center for research and publication on the Southwest. And so David and the governor joined forces, and the center opened its doors in 1996. And the main thing, and Don and I were talking about this earlier today, the main thing that the center does is to support external research fellows, postdoctoral scholars who come from outside of SMU to spend the year with us in residence, working to bring a book-length project to completion. And those fellows have been the greatest advertisement as well as the greatest success of the center. We do other public programming as well, but the fellowships are really the heart of what we do. So please carry that message back to other corners of the ASU campus, because I was telling Don, I'm not sure if we've ever had somebody from ASU come and spend a year with us. And certainly folks here are doing the kind of research that we really support.
And could you tell us a little bit about your role as director? So what does the director do?
Sure. So David Weber was the longtime director. He founded the center in the mid-90s, as I said, and then he served until, I think, right up until his retirement in 2007, 2008. And then Sherry Smith and Ben Johnson sort of split those duties before I came on board in 2011. And the idea, effectively, it's sort of a fun administrative job where I get to work closely with the fellows, to work on our other public programming, which includes the other big thing that we do every year is put on a symposium. And in fact, glad this has come up, we'll be partnering with Matt Garcia and the Comparative Border Studies program on a joint venture called Food Across Borders, which takes a look at sort of foodways in North America and beyond, and thinking about sort of these pretty critical agricultural issues. And so I help sort of oversee our symposium project, work closely with our fellows, and then, frankly, a lot of what I've done in the last couple of years is to go out and shake the trees for financial resources, if for no other reason than to prove that the center can go on after the recent passing of David Weber and also Governor Clements. So it's a fun job, but it keeps me busy.
Well, we think that you're doing an excellent job.
Well, thank you. It's been fun, but it's been dizzying.
For people in the audience who are not familiar with the book, could you give us a brief kind of overview
Sure.
about what the book is about?
Sure. So probably the simplest way to describe the book is as a family history, and I built it around 5 members drawn from a single family of mixed Indian white ancestry. And the book begins in the 1840s with the marriage of a white fur trader, a guy named Malcolm Clarke, who comes up the Missouri around 1840 after having been expelled not once but twice from West Point for challenging a classmate to a duel, and then after he was reinstated by none other than Andrew Jackson, who was in the waning days of his presidency, could not stay out of his own way, and then beat a classmate in 1836 and was expelled. Ends up in Texas after the Revolution, misses out on fortune and glory there, and ends up ultimately on the Upper Missouri, where he marries a Blackfoot woman, and they have 4 children of mixed ancestry that survive to adulthood.
No, wait a second. So this troublemaker east of the Mississippi goes to the west, and so it seems like he's going to make more trouble, right?
Yes, and he does.
Oh, okay.
And you pick up on some of the ambivalence that I've got towards Malcolm Clarke. He's really successful, and one of the most successful fur traders for the American Fur Company in the 1830s, 1840s, and even into the 1850s. But his career is it's marred by violence. You know, a handful of murders and homicides that I can connect him to. Many of them, he insists, were in self-defense. Others a bit more cold-blooded. But there's no doubt that he was a very loving and devoted father. So trying to square the various parts of his personality was something that I kind of really couldn't do at the end of the day. In the book, I sort of present both sides of this guy.
Malcolm Clarke, he's a very intriguing individual, and could you give us some insight to this very complicated, individual, his personality? I mean, it seemed like he didn't get along with formality and organizations, and now he's in the West, and he's entering a different structure, an Indian kind of sense of order, or whatever that may be. And what is he about? I mean, is he a good person, bad person, or
Well, one thing, he's very adaptable. I came to, I had very mixed feelings about him. He was sort of the beginning of the book in many ways. It was his story that I read fictionalized in, does anybody know Fool's Crow? Have you all read Fool's Crow by James Welch? It's Malcolm Clarke's murder at his ranch in 1869 that really sort of pulled me into this. I read about that in teaching Fool's Crow, which I probably used a half dozen times in courses on the West. And I was really interested when I was up in Montana one summer working on a different project to find out if Clarke was a real person or whether James Welch had just invented him to move the story along, because it's his murder that precipitates some of the later action in Fool's Crow. But he did exist, and so I found myself digging through whatever I could find on him at the Montana Historical Society, and what I discovered was that he was very appealing on any number of levels. Tall, handsome, strong, spoke several Indian languages as well as French, even a little bit of Spanish, was a very devoted father, no doubt, was a very successful fur trader, but he was definitely a guy who had an I think ungovernable temper at the end of the day, and this is what caused him to commit some homicides of his own, and it's what leads to sort of the ending of his own life, and he's just 52. So he, in some ways, was the character about whom I was most ambivalent. The others were, I think, easier to embrace in many other ways. Clarke, not so much.
And because of his difficult personality, did you find him hard to write about? Because how do you write a fair example of this person when it seems like he gets in trouble with everybody? He's the round peg trying to fit into the square hole at West Point.
Right.
And is there a square hole like in society among Native people?
Right. Well, that was one of the hardest things for me to really get a handle on. So again, I present a couple of sides of this. Is that his family? He has a very sort of prominent literate family in Montana, and they spent some time pretty much right after his death already burnishing his legacy. And so what I read from his daughter Helen Clarke, for instance, or from his Malcolm Clarke's sister, Charlotte. It's really sort of almost hagiographic stuff. They had enormous admiration for him, which again is understandable because of how accomplished he was and how successful he was in the Upper Missouri. But trying to get a handle on what Indians themselves thought of him, again, mixed stories. The stuff that Charlotte and that Helen write that Indians supposedly felt about Malcolm is pretty flattering. But in talking to people on the Blackfeet Reservation today, a far more mixed picture of Clarke emerges. And I tried to do him justice, which was to present the stuff that I could find from the historical record as fairly as possible. But I will admit that certainly in talking to people up in Browning, Montana, took a little of the wind out of my sails. I was more enthusiastic about Clarke before I started doing some of the oral history work, and by the end, a much more mixed portrait emerged.
I'd like to change directions a little bit because I'm always interested in titles and titles of books because the book is called The Red and the White. Notice the cover, I mean red and white, right?
It's funny, it was originally orange and green until my wife said, how can they give you orange and green cover for a book that has colors in the title? And I said, that's a good point. So,
well, let's talk about colors because it's The Red and the White, a family saga of the American West. So what else would you have called this? I mean, I'm surely it had a different working title. So how did you settle on this title, and what were the other possible titles?
That's a really good question. I actually preferred an earlier title that my publisher told me was too wordy or for whatever reasons did not like it, and that was called A Mixture of So Many Bloods, a family saga of the American West. Both of these come from primary source research that I did. So A Mixture of So Many Bloods comes out of a letter that Helen Clarke, who's probably the character in the book whose story most fascinated me, writes a letter in I think it's in 1911, to a novelist and playwright who had just written a book about the difficulties of an individual much like Helen, fictionalized treatment, called The Silent Call, about a man, and I'm blanking on his name, Henry, I believe, on the someplace on the northern plains, and his difficulty in sort of navigating his way between white and native worlds. And Helen Clarke had read this, and in 1911, this really resonated with her as somebody who also felt kind of stranded between two worlds. Wrote the novelist, the guy who wrote the play, and sort of fulminated against the ways in which she had been treated pretty badly in Montana, and talks about how ironic it is that the American, how does she describe? She has a couple of phrases, and then ultimately settles on how it is that the American, a mixture of so many breeds, is what it actually says. Bloods is how I originally read it, but how the white Americans could aggregate to themselves, or arrogate to themselves so much power and sort of and feel so secure in their own racial sort of status, when in fact the white American was himself or herself a mixture of so many breeds, bloods. Again, that's what I read. My publisher didn't like that, so instead picked something out. And again, they came up with a title, and I actually have come to like it, but they picked something out of a different sort of moment in the book, which also involves Helen Clarke. A friend of hers, another novelist, sometime in the 19-teens, writes a book called The White Quiver, which is a pretty hoary, indulges in a lot of stereotypes of, Indians as noble savages and so on, but clearly written with a lot of affection. Writes a book about sort of the mystic lore of the Indians in the early 20th century, and dedicates the book to Helen Clarke and to her brother Horace as people who had helped serve as conduits to that world, probably literally in introducing this woman, Helen Fitzgerald Sanders, to Indian informants on the reservation who spoke with her. But also I think she meant a bit more mystically, that she had sort of been able to channel this experience by talking with people like Helen and Horace. So she dedicates the book, I won't get it exactly right, but the epigraph is something along the lines of, I dedicate this to Helen Clarke, in whose race, or who mingles the best of the white race and the white race and the red. And so my publisher seized on that, pulled it out, and voila, a long answer to a simple question, but that's how the title came to be.
Well, that's why you're here. We've got some young scholars in the audience, and so could you share with us and share with them what is it about titles and authors wanting certain titles and your editor or your press doing something different? So
Sure.
What is your advice to them?
Well, give up, I guess, in the long run. You'd be surprised. And I had a wonderful working relationship with my editor, who's just terrific. And sort of a strange, sort of circular experience I actually used to work for way back when I was a lowly editorial assistant at St. Martin's Press in the mid-1990s, my first job post-college. I worked for Bob Weil as an editorial assistant. He treated me very well and was a wonderful mentor. Many years later, we stayed in touch over the years. We then were actually able to work together on this book. He has since moved to a different publishing house, but we had a really wonderful working relationship, and most of what Bob touches turns to gold. So I was very inclined to defer to him. But I was a little bit nervous about the title in some ways, because if people didn't sort of read inside and get a sense of where it came from, it sounds as if me as the author, that I am indulging in the same sort of hoary stereotypes about Indians and white Americans. And Bob told me, and I think he was right in the long run, he said, if people sort of push back against that, you'll have a very ready answer, which is that if it just read the book more closely, it's embedded right there in the text, which is true. But it's one of those many things. The publishers often think they know best, and again, in this case, I really felt like I was very well treated. But so much of what you might want to do for the marketing, for the publicity, and so on, even for the titles, for the cover images, it's really out of your hands. You're welcome to suggest, but you will very often not prevail.
Okay. You've talked about so far the white fur trader who comes west, but how about the native woman, Coth-co-co-na, and tell us about her.
Sure. She's definitely the hardest of the 5 individuals in the book to track. Coth-co-co-na is the hardest. So the book is built around the 2 of them. I actually start with Coth-co-co-na and really talk as much about the Blackfeet and their experience of sort of the white Anglo-American invasion of their country in the early 19th century. The first chapter is about her, then about her husband, Malcolm Clarke, then 2 of their children, Helen, who I've mentioned, and her brother Horace, and then their grandson, John Clarke, Horace's son. So I built the book around these 5 individuals. She was the hardest to track by far, because she only pops up in a census record here or there, maybe a reminiscence from a pioneer. So what I had to do in her case was really to infer a lot from various ethnographies that were written about the time and the place. And it was fun to do, but it really required, in some ways, the most sort of imaginative leaps. But at the end, I conclude and certainly hope, or assume, I guess, is that her experience is not unlike most women, most Blackfeet women of the time and of the place. And so I rely much more on sort of a general inference to be able to kind of recreate her story.
So she's kind of like a Sacagawea, so that we don't know a whole lot about her, so we have to kind of put pieces of the puzzle kind of around of what she might have been like.
Exactly.
Now she played, I think, a very important role, but in Native society, then she would have had a very important role there. But with the fur trade coming, that type of entrepreneurship coming to the West, that part of the country, then does she play a different kind of role?
I think the women in the fur trade, certainly I wouldn't be the first historian to say this, are absolutely indispensable sort of linkages. And one of the questions, I knew the answer to the question, but I really needed to be able to spend some time being able to spin it out satisfactorily in the book. Why would the Blackfeet, particularly, who really resisted white encroachment, probably as much as any other group on the Northern Plains, why would they, within a few decades, be giving their daughters in marriage to white fur traders? And sort of the basic answer that, again, I think fits with what most historians have probably discovered and argued in their books, is that this had real economic benefits for a native man to marry his daughter to a white fur trader. That meant access to the trader's goods, especially manufactured goods, but also alcohol, tobacco, firearms. Those were useful in their own right for immediate consumption, but also really useful for being able to distribute them as patronage to other members of the tribe, which would be very helpful in winning a leadership position, because being able to be generous was absolutely critical in being able to win some sort of a leadership position. Then, of course, you look at the other end and say, what would have been sort of the appeal? I mean, obviously there are sort of appeals of sort of kinship and frankly even more basic things like love and companionship that would lead a white man to take a native wife. But economics again play a really critical, if not determinative, role. being able to marry a young Native woman meant that a fur trader like Malcolm Clarke would win access to his father-in-law's best animal products, beaver pelts originally, and then eventually bison hides and bison robes. That's not all there was to the Clarke relationship, and I had some pushback in the early going. Some colleagues of mine who were really insistent about not romanticizing these relationships, which most of them sort of see as sort of transactional. But what I will say about Malcolm Clarke is, unlike a lot of fur traders, he does not abandon his so-called country wife as soon as the fur trade plays out and go back east, as so many fur traders did.
Yes.
Instead, he remains on the upper Missouri with his family and is quite committed to his wife and to his children. It ultimately cost him his life, and I don't want to suggest that Clarke was, as I've told you in many other ways, he's a guy who's hard to wrap your arms around. But I think his commitment to his family is something that is, in the end, rather honorable, and that he was unlike many of his colleagues in the fur trade in remaining on the upper Missouri.
Well, you stole my next question. So what I wanted to pursue a little bit was, if this type of relationship is really kind of customary for the time, and the native wife becomes a liaison, and so it's really kind of a financial arrangement, and a lot of fur trade men, they leave their native wives when they go back to the east, go back home. Is this a special relationship? If it is a special relationship, is she special, and how special is she? Is she individually a strong individual, or is she just kind of go along for the ride? He's quite unusual and kind of extraordinary himself, because he's so rigid sometimes and very difficult to get along with.
Right. It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a ready answer to that.
Just make something up.
It's what we do.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say about their relationship, so far as I can understand it, I think it was particularly close. I think you see that in the fact that they stayed together. Now, one thing that I should add is that Clarke did take another native wife late, I believe it was in 1865, after he'd settled on his ranch in Helena, and he had other children. They are almost impossible to track. Little, bits and pieces survive
And how
here
did
and
that
there.
go with the first wife?
Very hard to know. My guess is that it's certainly not an unusual arrangement during the fur trade period. Perhaps less typical in the 1860s as the fur trade is really beginning to play out. But he does. He takes a second wife, a Blackfoot woman named Good Singing, and he has a couple of children. At least two he may have more than two. At least two die in infancy and are buried in a family plot there. And so little is said about them, and I don't know why that is. Whether that is because of discomfort with the family that he had with Coth-co-co-na. Certainly, there's not a lot said in Helen Clarke's reminiscence, although she mentions by name, if not explaining the relationship, other people who were present at the ranch the night that her father was murdered, and these are people sort of connected to that other family.
Could you tell us a little bit more details about the murder?
Be happy to.
And how does he die?
Sure. But only to finish that thought about sort of the relationship between Coth-co-co-na and Clarke, I guess the question that I have is, what would it have looked like if he had not been killed at his ranch in 1869? Would this family have stayed together on this ranch north of Helena? I think it's one of those interesting unanswerable questions. But to his murder, so Clarke had been very prominent in the fur trade. He retires in the early 1860s for reasons that are a little bit hard to track. I've got some conflicting stories. One of them is that perhaps this is because the fur trade was really playing out. There's actually no doubt about that the trade in buffalo robes was drying up, partly because of depleting numbers of bison had been overhunted by Indians, and also, of course, especially by white hide hunters. But also perhaps because he definitely murders, he argues in self-defense, but perhaps in cold blood, a guy named Owen Mackenzie, who was the son of a very prominent Anglo fur trader, a guy named Kenneth Mackenzie. That happens in 1863 or 1864. And then, so Clarke retires from the fur trade pretty abruptly. The thought is that, he wanted to remove himself from the trade after he had sort of made a lot of enemies from the murder of Owen Mackenzie. So he's living on his ranch north of Helena with both of these families together under one roof on a piece of property that's actually now, in sort of an interesting side note, owned by the Baucus family. If anybody knows Max Baucus, I think who's now recently retired as a senior senator from Montana. The Baucus has now owned the Seaman Ranch, as it is called. Clarke establishes this ranch at a pass in the mountains on the road between Helena and Fort Benton, which are the two most important Montana settlements. And it's there that he's living in August of 1869 when his wife's cousin, an Indian named Pete Owlchild, when he shows up at the Clarke Ranch on a night of August 16th, 17th, 1869, shows up unannounced, not totally unusual in that he'd been an occasional visitor, ties of kinship held these folks together. The timing was odd in that it was, long after dark, 9 o'clock, I guess, is the time. And he's welcomed in to the house with a couple of his friends. They sit down, they have dinner around the table, and then afterwards, Clarke is invited outside onto the porch at his ranch house to have a smoke. And as he steps outside, Indian bolts from the brush, somebody else, not one of the 4 or 5 who'd come inside with Pete Owlchild, and shoots Clarke in the chest at point blank range. As he's sort of lurching backwards, Owlchild then sort of cleaves his forehead with an axe. And so Clarke is killed right there in front of his daughter Helen, both of his wives, and a couple other of his children. And why that is, again, is something that I go into in the book. What would have precipitated this? And there are a couple of different sort of rival accounts that are hard to square.
The book is done. It's won an important award. And so the book is on the shelf of many libraries. So now that the book is on the shelf, what do you think about the book? As you walk by the book and you look at it, and what does it mean to you now that it's done and it's there on the shelf? Collecting dust, but also
Collecting dust, indeed.
memories and tears.
I wish it were collecting more readers. I guess everybody says that.
I think it will.
But yeah, in the end, actually, I'm really pleased with how it turned out. It's I look back on it, and it's largely the book that it really is. It's basically the book that I set out to write. And in some ways, it was much easier to write than the first book, which I guess is also probably the difference between a dissertation and a book that you come to on the other side of tenure and promotion. But what's interesting is that it's a book that I had wanted to write without knowing that it would be the Clarkes who would be the subject of the book. I was really interested in the Métis, peoples of mixed native white ancestry, based on the writing of my first book. I had never heard of such individuals who are recognized as separate Aboriginal people in Canada. In the U.S., there's no such sort of provision for peoples who are usually categorized as either white or Indian, because it's a much more sort of binary racial classification system here in the U.S. But I was really interested in such people, and surely I knew they had existed in the U.S., but they were much harder to track in the archival record. And it was because of the difficulty of tracking them that I kind of gave up on this project until I stumbled upon the Clarkes in Montana in 2006, having gone up to Helena to do a totally different book on the Cypress Hills Massacre, and I got bored with that project in the early going. I think it's actually still, somebody's asked me since, has anybody done anything on that? And I say, no, I think it's still actually a rich topic, perhaps, for somebody more dogged than I. But I kind of gave up on that and was sort of kind of bumping around in the archives looking for something else to occupy my time, because I was there for a whole month. I couldn't go back empty-handed. And I stumbled upon the Clarkes, and I ever after, I was pretty obsessed with them. And it carried me through without really any dull moments. And I say that honestly. There may have been some hard moments, but there weren't any dull moments in researching the family. And I also wanted to write something that was a narrative, which, I certainly enjoyed writing my first book on the Rangers and on the Mounties, but the stories were really submerged there. It was much more on sort of developing and maintaining an analytical frame. That relationship is inverted in this book. This is, I followed the story pretty doggedly. And the analysis, while it's certainly there, is a bit more muted. And I kind of have ghettoized it at different points in the chapter and really let the stories do most of the work. And in the end, I was really pleased with that. It's the kind of writing that I would really like to do, I think, going forward. But nothing is ever perfect, and there are certainly some things that I might do differently where I'd do it all over again.
Well, that is my next question then. So if you were, because it's a fascinating story, it's a fascinating narrative that you built. So what is it that you might have done different in this book? Organization, left out one of the characters, added another character, or what?
Right. I think I probably would have tried to dig a bit more deeply into the other family, into Clarke's other family. I'm not sure if it would have changed the story. In fact, I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't have. But I do think that there were a couple of sort of archival avenues that I did not go down. And partly because I think many of them were going to lead into cul-de-sacs or, or dead ends. But I think that it would have been interesting to try and follow out a couple of the other branches of the family. One of the reasons why I didn't do that is because there are not huge numbers of Clarke family descendants for one basic reason. So Malcolm Clarke and his wife Coth-co-co-na had 4 children that lived to adulthood. Helen Clarke, who's a chapter in one of the books, had no children, never married. She said, perhaps apocryphally, but I've seen it written down enough times that I believe there's probably some truth to it, because she believed that no white man would treat her as an equal, and she considered marrying an Indian man beneath her, which she thought of of an individual of mixed ancestry as a marriage partner. She doesn't say. Helen has no children and never marries. Horace Clarke has many children, but only a couple live to adulthood. Because most of them were carried off by an epidemic of scarlet fever on the reservation. His son, whom I write about, John Clarke, also has only one child, a woman named Joyce Clarke Turvey, who serves as really sort of my conduit to the Clarke family. I interviewed her several times early on, but she was John Clarke's only child, and although she adopted, and has a couple of children of her own. But who themselves have small families. So I guess the larger point of this is there's not a large Clarke family footprint, not a large Clarke family tree that I could have followed branching out. So in many ways, I sort of let those trails grow a little bit cold, perhaps, where I might have been able to sort of turn up some additional stories and certainly some additional family members.
The details are rich. So much depth and about the landscape and their trade, the beaver pelts, relations with other Indians. But in all of this, what does all of this symbolize? What does it tell us about the American West at that time, or what's happening? So,
well, it's interesting. I was working on this book at the same time that Ann Hyde was writing Empires, Nations, and Families, which is wonderful. I imagine many of you know, which is sort of this is a microhistory. Ann's is sort of a macro historical approach, taking a look at the importance of a handful of intermarried families and their role effectively in settling the West, and the importance then of those serving almost to pave the way for the westward spread of the American nation, or empire, if you want to call it that, as she certainly does, after the Civil War. And I think that's a brilliant book that captures many of the same stories, but on this much larger level. I think she's in many ways hunting bigger game, trying to really offer us a new interpretation of the American West. This operates on a smaller level, but what I hope that it does is that it illustrates a couple of things. I think one of them would be the transition in the West, the trans-Mississippi West, which is one of the last places that peoples of mixed ancestry really are able to, where their communities thrive and flourish in the 19th century. What happens to those communities after that part of the country is gobbled up by the American nation after the Civil War? And I think that this shows, hopefully in really rich, sort of finely drawn detail, what that looks like for one family. That was really what I was after in this. What does it look like? And I don't think the Clarkes they're exceptional. This is a question that's been asked to me a couple of times. They're exceptional in that their personal stories are really compelling, and a couple of them achieve really fascinating success. Helen Clarke has a career as a Broadway stage actress. She serves as a lotting agent in Oklahoma during the 1890s. Horace Clarke, his Indian allotment on the Blackfeet Reservation later becomes, in many ways, a piece of Glacier National Park. So they have these stories that match up with, that are sort of national in scope, but in many ways I think they're actually quite typical of what happens to peoples of mixed ancestry as that space for such people contracts pretty sharply after the Civil War. And so I hope that what this book does more than anything is to sort of give a really textured feel for what that process looks like in the Rocky Mountain West. after the Civil War and sort of the changing racial landscape in Montana, but also the wider West. I think this happens in Colorado. I think it happens in New Mexico. I think these stories play out pretty similarly, although obviously with different families and different individuals.
Again, back to our graduate students in the audience, because what advice can you share with them about scholarly writing? Tips, clues, points of wisdom, what would you share with them?
Well, I touched on it a little bit earlier. I'd say, which is to follow what you love. So I went up to Montana having written what I thought was sort of an airtight grant. I guess it worked because it got me the fellowship at the Montana Historical Society. But I went up there pretty committed to doing this project on the Cypress Hills Massacre, which is this sort of obscure 1873 event that I thought I could use to help explain the hardening of the U.S.-Canada boundary ever after. I was pretty excited about the project. You know, I'd done a fair amount of work to find out that there'd be good archival sources in the Historical Society there. But when I got there and started doing some of the archival research, I realized a couple of things. One, that the material, the story fascinated me, but sort of the context was actually a little less gripping than I had expected. There was going to be a lot of work in sort of company archives, trying to understand business rivalries on the Northwestern Plains, which was sort of the necessary backdrop to this rather interesting but obscure event. When I came across the Clarkes in the archives that day, about halfway through my stay, that was, you know, I fell down the rabbit hole. That has sort of sustained my interest ever after in a way that I don't think the Cypress Hills Massacre ever could have. So the point there was to follow your interest, and it sounds very sort of easy and pat to say that, but it's really true. I don't know what would have happened if I had found Cypress Hills Massacre a bit more enticing in the early going. I still don't think it would have sustained me over the 5 or 6 years that I worked on this book. So I think follow your interest, and it's very hard to say that you will ever go wrong. I think that it will sustain you in the writing process. It will certainly sustain you in the research process. Because I wanted to know more about the Clarkes, and it took me some crazy places. I really did not think that I would ever have reason to, spend time in archives and the NARA branch in Fort Worth, for instance, or I forget what the name of the archive is. I guess the Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City. I spent time in the National Archives in Washington and other places. I could never have imagined that I would have wanted to spend as much time in these places as I did, but trying to track the Clarkes became, something almost obsession-like for me, after the first sort of taste in the Montana History Archives.
I guess what I hear you also saying is to write the doctoral dissertation that you want to write, rather
Yes.
than, because it used to be a long time ago that you would write the dissertation that your dissertation advisor told you to write. And you hated him or her because, you were forced to write that, and it was something that you didn't really want to do. But in the wisdom of the dissertation director, then they knew what would make a good book.
Right.
So you're saying don't do that.
Careful.
Okay,
Okay, so you have
careful,
students in the
yes.
room here. I think that writing what you want to write from the very beginning, and writing it also. This is advice that maybe I'm perhaps stepping outside the boundaries here, but I've heard it said after the fact. Write a dissertation like you're writing a book. Don't write a dissertation simply to satisfy various requirements and then intend to pull it apart to write something that is a bit more appealing to you, that you then think you can sort of pitch to a book publisher. I would say that if you can write the dissertation as a book, at least in theory, from the very beginning, pacing it that way, structuring it similarly, foregrounding the things that you think really are the important parts, not necessarily being hung up on your first chapter being this very sort of overly wrought literature review. There's a place for that, certainly, but it may be more in your footnotes actually than in the text of the dissertation itself, because it will make that process easier to convert to a book manuscript. So I think writing what excites you, absolutely, and then also writing it in a way that is pretty easily translatable to the book model is it'll save you a lot of time and probably some headaches and probably some heartache as well, down the road. So I would certainly say that is at least for me, I think, kind of a worthy goal.
Yeah. Well, it used to be the saying that the best kind of dissertation is a done dissertation.
Yes.
But I think it's really kind of changed that the best kind of dissertation is a done important dissertation.
Yes, and I think that because all publishers these days are finding that it's harder and harder to to acquire and to promote academic monographs. I think being able to write something that from the very beginning you not only believe will be significant, but that you're able to explain from the very beginning its significance, why this project matters. And I think part of that also will come from your own investment in it. I think it's a lot easier to make that case if you are, if you're really enthusiastic about the subject. You will certainly have moments, as in any relationship, you will have valleys as well as peaks. But I think being able to really focus on why the dissertation is important, but also why it matters to you, I think that can help. I've been on hiring committees and I've seen plenty of job talks. I think that the ones that are most successful are always the ones where the job candidate or the author is able to say and to convey what it is that's important, but also really exciting and fresh, and why he or she is so invested in it. Because you want that enthusiasm, both in the books that you read, but in the classes that you imagine a future colleague might teach.
We can have some questions from the audience now for Dr.
I
Graybill.
would love some questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Sure.
Andy, what do you see the contribution of your book being to the literature on race in the West? Where you've been in that literature? What new insight are you giving us about race in the West?
Oh, I think one of them, and it's probably touch on something that I've already talked a little bit about, but I think one of them is suggesting that there was space for peoples of mixed ancestry that went far beyond the so-called middle ground, which I think most historians imagine ended in the early 19th century. I think that one of the things that I was not surprised to discover, I guess I was intrigued to discover, was how these communities really did persist until they were overwhelmed by an influx of Anglo-Americans, particularly families. I think it's probably too tidy to say that things get really complicated when white women show up, but I think there is something to that the dynamics on the ground change pretty dramatically once white men have white women as partners to choose from, and what that implies then for sort of racial boundaries in these given fur trade communities, because they almost are all fur trade communities, whether it's in the Great Lakes, the lower Mississippi, Texas, on the Pacific coast. But those bases really persist a lot longer, I think, than some historians believe. And I think that there's a way in which it's almost it's a little bit heartbreaking to see that as an alternative model that does get repeatedly washed away. But those communities really did persist in certain parts of the American West. I think the Rockies really are sort of the last redoubt into the period after the Civil War, and then ultimately, as those sort of most inaccessible places are pulled into the orbit of the U.S. Certainly in the case of the Blackfeet, a window or a curtain comes down pretty dramatically. For the Blackfeet, it's especially dramatic. It's right after the Marias Massacre, which is sort of the fulcrum on which my book turns. And then ever after, there's much less space. But I wouldn't say that it disappears entirely, but the politics certainly change. And one of the things that I know Don had thought about discussing was, what might be next in terms of writing about Indian history and Western history. I think one of them is to really get a feel for the politics of identity politics on the reservation. I think that's something that's really interesting, and at least to my mind, a bit understudied. What one of my interview subjects called bloodism, which he used to explain, somebody himself of mixed ancestry who identifies as Blackfeet, but explained to me that nowadays, if in the early 20th century, U.S. government officials wanted to deal with peoples who were of mixed ancestry, thinking that the more sort of Anglo-American ancestry they had, the more pliable they might be, the more reasonable they might be in trying to sort of press various federal initiatives on them. That situation is really inverted now. In the early 21st century, peoples who, the less Indian ancestry you can claim, the more marginal your voice tends to be on the reservation. And I think sort of studying that transformation, I think is really interesting. I'm not sure that I'll be the one to do it, but I think it's trying to get a feel for identity politics on the reservation today is a really rich area of study. Long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
You mentioned oral history, and I was wondering to what extent first oral history informed your project, and also methodologically how you went about kind of doing these oral interviews while making contacts, actually connecting them to gain insight into basically 19th century story.
Right. It's a good question, and I think that it's one of the things that I'm proudest of. But it also goes back to a question that Don asked about what I might do differently. I might have done even more oral history. I did as much as I could really manage, both economically, because it to pay for translation services and so on. Translation is not the right word. Transcription. Thank you. Although a couple of folks that I worked with definitely had a fair amount of fluency in Piegan. Our interviews were conducted entirely in English because I don't. But to pay for transcription services, it's very expensive to do this, and so I did as many as basically that I could afford. But they totally transformed the project. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them was I had certain ideas about how Helen Clarke might have been perceived on the reservation because she is involved in the early 20th century in negotiations that ultimately led to a pretty painful episode of Blackfeet history, which is the sale of the so-called ceded strip, which is a piece on the western end of the Blackfeet Reservation, which has become Glacier National Park. Belonged to the Blackfeet, and they were cajoled into selling it, probably far below what they could very reasonably have expected. But Helen Clarke played a role in those negotiations, and ultimately, from what I gather, she urged the Blackfeet to sell. And I think the reason that she did so was because she had deployed herself the power of the federal government in encouraging various groups in Oklahoma to take allotments. And so she knew the power of the federal government, and they were going to get what they wanted by one way or another. And probably in this case, it would have been by withholding rations and sort of starving the Blackfeet into submission, which I would argue is violence of a different form, but violence nevertheless. But I assumed that the Blackfeet today would have thought of her as something of a sellout, or would have looked at her sort of askance, because this is still an open wound among the Blackfeet. They lost all the rights. They had been promised certain rights, hunting rights, access rights, in what became Glacier National Park, all of which were almost immediately abrogated. And so I had expected that, that the Blackfeet would look upon Helen a bit skeptically. But in talking to folks, one guy in particular, a guy named Darrell Kipp, who was very recently deceased, but a really interesting guy who was incredibly generous in sitting and talking with me for a couple of hours one Saturday morning when I went up to Browning. He said that in fact, as far as he was concerned, what Helen Clarke had done, she did out of love, because at that point, what the federal government was asking, or what the Blackfeet were asking in terms of financial compensation, that how could you put a price on the mountains if you have starving children who are in your midst? How do you argue that the mountains are worth $3 million instead of $1.5 million? You do what you need to do in order to guarantee, to the best of your ability, the survival of future generations. And so it was really a revelation for Darrell to tell me that he felt that Helen Clarke had actually acted in good faith, and with very sincere motivation. So the oral histories, and of course there's so much more, in terms of context, in terms of the circumstances of Malcolm Clarke's murder. White people have one story, the Indians have a very different one that are impossible to reconcile. But the texture of the book is very different for the oral histories. But in terms of the method, what I relied on were people in Montana who were willing to help me make connections, and I was humbled by the generosity of folks being willing to talk to me, because I felt like a double outsider, somebody who's not native, but also somebody who's not even Montanan, for that, to sort of show up in their midst and sort of ask, politely, I hope, if they'd be willing to sit and talk with me. And I was amazed at the number of people who I was never told no. In fact, I batted 1,000 for the 6 or 7 oral histories that I conducted. People would sit and talk with me. A couple of times they'd ask that certain things not be attributed to them, or maybe not appear in the book at all, and I certainly honored those. But I was amazed at how willing people were to sit and to talk with me, even recognizing some of my limitations. I really appreciated their willingness to share with me these stories that add so much to the book. The book would have been very different and not as good without their input. And I loved it too. Talking to people. It's one thing to read archival material that's been sitting in the National Archives for 100 years or wherever else, but to talk to real live people and to get their take on things, and then also to work through that, which I guess is the other part of your question, how to sort of square that with the archival record. In some cases you can't, and I guess what I came to understand was that oral history is no more, but also no less problematic than written records. That there are gaps and inconsistencies. And you do your very best, based on extensive research, to be able to put them all together, and then mostly in footnotes. But if it's really important, right in the text itself, to sort of acknowledge where the lights go out. I guess that's sort of what Linda Gordon has said about the great Arizona orphan abduction, where you really kind of can't tell the story, where you're feeling around the edges of it, but you know that the pictures are complete. But I don't think oral history is any more problematic than written records in that regard.
Other questions?
I'd love more questions.
So what's going to happen with the transcriptions of the oral histories, or what has happened, perhaps?
It's a good question. They sit in my they sit on my hard drive of my computer. I haven't done much with them. I have certainly talked to folks back on the reservation about them. But it might make a lot of sense. I'm glad you've asked this. It might make sense for me to offer them up. I secured all the requisite releases, and there's no reason why they shouldn't find a home elsewhere, perhaps at the Blackfoot Community College, which is where a lot of the folks that I talked to, it was their affiliation, people who were the travel colleges, and Catherine and I talked about this yesterday, I think is an absolutely fascinating subject of study in and of themselves, but also sort of preservers of so many sort of oral archival sources. Might make a very good place. Leave it to the librarian to have the good idea about what to do with it. I think that would be a good place for them to end up.
Other questions? Could you give us a bit of a preview about the next project?
Oh, yeah. So it will be a little while in coming. I'm just at the trailhead. In fact, I've really done only secondary reading at this point. But because I do direct the Clements Center for Southwest Studies, and this project had me on the Northern Plains, my interests lead me naturally to this place, but it also would probably, make sense given where I'm located now. I want to write a history of the Taos Revolt of 1847. I'm curious how many of you know about this. Most folks know about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and I had sort of conversations that have sort of started and gone down the road a bit before we realized we're talking about very different things. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, very well known, although there's certainly more that one could say about it, I'm sure. But the Taos Revolt of 1847 is something I got interested in when I spent some time. SMU has a satellite campus, a lovely place just south of Ranchos de Taos. And on the site there, it was the site of a former military garrison, Cantonment Fort Burgwin, which was established in the 1840s after the U.S. conquest of New Mexico. But I was really, and it was the base, that was a launching point for an expedition against the Taos Pueblo in 1847, where a joint group of Pueblo Indians and Hispanos sort of united to resist the American territorial governor, Charles Bent, of the Bent family, which has many intriguing parallels to the Clarks, intermarried white trader with an indigenous woman. At any rate, the Hispanos and the Indians rise up in January 1847 to resist sort of this American territorial acquisition, and it sort of occasions a pretty bloody, sort of put down by the U.S. Army operating out of this military post. But I think it's a really interesting episode to sort of pry open these questions about a couple of things. One, the so-called land of enchantment, which in New Mexicans would always have you believe that Anglos, Hispanos, and Indians exist in perfect harmony. I think suggests that's not true, but you'd be surprised at how dogged that myth is. But also, I think to really give a sense of what's going on in northern New Mexico during the so-called bloodless conquest. The idea is that that the Americans under Kearny sort of rolled in and pretty easily occupied New Mexico and that basically that without firing a shot. That may actually be true in the capture of Santa Fe, but things are quite different in northern New Mexico, and I want to use this to sort of understand what sort of the expansion of the American empire into the Southwest really looked like from the perspective of Indians and Hispanos in the late 1840s. So where that will go, who knows, but I've got a lot of work yet to do. I've really just started kind of the requisite background reading.
Well, we're looking forward to it. I'd like to end with one last question,
Sure.
a short question, but like a takeaway in a couple of sentences, here's the book. What would you like people to kind of know about it in maybe a couple of sentences, and what would the takeaway be about this book?
Well, I think to me it's a pretty basic one, but it's the one that I was left with. Is that racial identity then as now is incredibly complex. We like in the U.S. clearly to sort of package things in pretty binary forms, which is why Barack Obama is always described as the first black president. That he certainly is, but as we all know, he also had a white mother. And so in the attempt to kind of flatten out the complexities of lived experience, certainly as sort of refracted through race, I'd like to think that my book kind of muddies those waters a little bit and explains the ways in which it's always a complex and ongoing process. And I also hope that folks will be intrigued by the story of the Clarkes. I do think that in many ways they're representative of intermarried families on the Northern Plains and throughout the West, but they do have really compelling individual stories, and I hope that the people will be as intrigued by them as I was. That was really what sustained me throughout the writing of the book, with these fascinating, inspiring, at times horrifying, sort of lives, and what they and what the Clarkes, sort of how they navigated this transition to a very different world on the other side of the Civil War and into the early 20th century.
Dr. Graybill,
Thank you,
pleasure.
Don.
Thank you for sharing this book with us and your work and your thoughts.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.